few remarks by way of situating what we're doing within the larger, let's say, PCC context, if by that we mean a context that takes into account not just the practical specifics of what we're doing in this course, which is a kind of radical practice for, given the contemporary paradigm, a practice for re-enchantment of the cosmos and for reconnecting our psyches to the larger psychic field of the Earth and the solar system and the cosmos. It's but I want to here bring in a perspective that also takes into account something that can be lost in discussions of astrology, where, for example, disenchantment is like seen as being an essential negative, like a big evolutionary wrong turn. And, in a sense, CIIS and PCC are on the side of the angels and enchantment, and the mainstream academic world is on the other side, on the side of disenchantment and the loss of soul in the world and the spiritual and psychological impoverishment that and alienation and et cetera that unfolds from that. Everything about that way of viewing things is, I think, second nature to most of us in this room. I mean, it's the converse of what it would be second nature to if this were a typical room full of graduate students in astrophysics at a mainstream university. So we're carrying the other side of the paradigm here. Yeah, great. I'm glad you can get in there, Lily. So, in a way, core to what I feel is another dimension of PCC's frame of reference that we're all building towards, and I think probably the people that have been most conscientiously carrying this part of it are in the PCC world would be, well, it's been at front and center for me, but Sean also carries a lot of this. It's also in Robert, because Steiner carries it. But it's basically an idea that there's an evolution going on, and in that evolution, disenchantment's playing a role. Disenchantment is not just a bad turn, a self-destructive act of massive denial, which it can be portrayed that way, including like by many of our heroes, like James Hillman would often describe that we need a return of soul to the world, and that the enemies are, as he would put it, Cartesian Christian consciousness that isolated soul in the individual human and removed it from the world. So what I wanted to do just briefly is to give us a little bit of a handle on what we're doing in this class in a larger context of historically. It's history that always plays the crucial role for me, because if we enter into history with a sympathetic imagination, one that allows us to enter into other worldviews, including the early modern worldview that was moving towards disenchantment, and to see that what was going on there was not simply a kind of brute act of appropriation of all the meaning and purpose in the universe to the human being, so that we could objectify and then thereby rule the universe as ruthless oppressors, using our instrumental reason as the tremendous power by which we would govern the rest of the world. I mean, that's one way of framing modern civilization, and it's not entirely inaccurate, but it leaves out the fact, I mean, if I were to put it in one single sentence, one of the things that it leaves out is the fact that what brought forth the modern self and the disenchantment of the world and the buffering of the individual self, so that it didn't feel as permeably susceptible to the influences of the astral deities or the spirits in the forest, or the imminent intracosmic forces that were at work in the medieval mindset or in the ancients, the primal. A lot of the motivation was a moral motivation, moving towards a sense of self-possession and moral self-responsibility, and an overcoming of a certain field of fear that comes when you feel vulnerable to many forces, because in any Anima Mundi has a very lovely aura to it, but it's full of very problematic beings and spirits and possession states and the producing of a feeling of tremendous vulnerability, so the great revolution that takes place in consciousness in the later Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, which is huge, though the Reformation is building on late medieval developments that happened inside Catholicism, that were kind of pulling in moral self-responsibility away from this vulnerability to an enchanted world. We can, and then particularly with the full-fledged, the Enlightenment and the full emergence of the modern moral rational self. Even Descartes is a lot of what's motivating him is not just like rational conquest of understanding the world. It's moral mastery, self-mastery over desires, instincts, passions that can be very destructive and that can result in very hurtful behavior to others, etc. So more is going on. So in this, I want to just quote from a remarkable passage in one of Charles Taylor's books. This is one of his big, later, massive books called A Secular Age. And in it, here he was describing with uncanny, this is a guy who's like a modern philosopher, probably, I would say, I mean, by many, he's regarded as our greatest living philosopher. And he has a very generous engagement with other eras, other philosophers, ideas, other religion. He's a model, I think, for all of us as we engage ideas and let's say academic or scholarly antagonists that we are on the opposite sides of with our ideas. He really is a model for how to engage them. So here he is with great act of the sympathetic imagination. He's entered into the mindset, the mode of consciousness that really pervaded the human condition prior to the buffering of the modern self that takes place rapidly between the 15th and 17th century. And in this case, he's talking about what a fuzzy line it was that separated the inner and the outer, and the human from the world. And he calls this fuzziness the condition of influence, that things could influence one not in the way that we moderns tend to think of, well, this external event affected me, and therefore I was traumatized by this event happening to me, or I've taken this chemical and it's having this, creating this response inside my consciousness that's related to the biochemistry, the biochemical processes at work. There's that kind of influence, but by and large, I have much more of a sense of a kind of buffered autonomy by which I engage the world. And by contrast, in the medieval experience, and this would be true for thousands of years before it, but it was still very vivid in the medieval and early Renaissance context, magic was a given reality. The magic of the church was, the church controlled the white magic, the host, the forgiveness of sins, these things could actually be abused. Taylor has some very funny descriptions of how people would use the belief in these magical powers within the sacrament, the Holy Eucharist, the chalices and so forth that are used in the sacred rituals. He has some very funny. This actually happened at times where people would, for example, want to send, within a Christian context, send a hex against somebody they didn't like, and so they would have a mass said for their deceased soul, even though they were alive. That kind of move, but his main point is to just describe how if you're going through the woods could be haunted. There could be certain places, words, objects, times of the year that have special kind of magical powers that are pervading the atmosphere that you necessarily come under the power of when you, if you live in that enchanted universe. And here he brings in, how this can happen for good or evil. And for example, with the experience of possession states, but also of positive influences, people spoke of possession when our higher faculties and powers seemed totally eclipsed. For instance, when people fell into delirium. But in a sense, any evil influence involves some eclipse of the highest capacities in us. But in the case of good influence, for instance, when we are filled with grace, which is a central concept in Christianity and Catholicism, only then do we become one with the agent or force through which what is best and highest in us, through what is best and highest in us. So in that case, the possession state from the evil is seen as being something that eclipses your higher potential, higher self, and possesses you and blinds you and eclipses your consciousness in some ways, while the positive grace actually helps you flower authentically into at a higher level. So there's a difference between those two kinds of influence. Demons may possess us, but God or the Holy Spirit enter us or quicken us from within. Okay, but then he said, whether for good or evil, influence does away with sharp boundaries. Say someone falls in love, and this has an impact, good or ill, on that person's life. Now, we would think of it as an internal event, although it could be susceptible to pressures from outside, such as external events that might affect us. But now let's say that we see this whole side of life as under the aegis of a goddess, Aphrodite. That means that the falling in love experience, the romantic process, is going well when it's being smiled on by Aphrodite. This not only means that she is keeping the external dangers at bay, like a human patron. She's, in this aspect, she's causally responsible for the conditions being propitious. So you can almost picture the astral deity, Venus, or Aphrodite, who is smiling on this potential relationship and kind of keeping that person from coming into the room at the wrong time that would have derailed this first kiss, or whatever. That was Aphrodite smiling on the potential unfolding of the relationship, like a human patron, as he put it, except that she's got special powers that go beyond what a human patron could do, because she's a goddess. It also means that the blooming of the right internal motivation is a gift from her. So it's not just like the external circumstances happily conspired to create this meeting of two people, and just the candlelight was just right, and etc. But the right internal motivation, that also is a gift from her. In other words, my being in the highest motivational condition is not just a fact about my inner realm of desires. It is my being the recipient of the gift of the goddess. We can't place the highest condition unambiguously within us. It's more placed in that interspace where the gift is received, the interspace between me and Aphrodite. It's much more of a permeable boundary. It's much more of it's kind of Whiteheadian, really. Much more of a kind of relational field we're embedded in. Now, imagine that this is not a theory, but it's how we sense things to be and how we seem to experience them. Then the inside is no longer just inside, it's also outside. That is, emotions which are in the very depths of human life, which we moderns think of our emotions being way in here, deep in my interior. If I want to really pay attention to what my feelings are, I go inside. Emotions which are in the very depths of human life exist in a space which takes us beyond ourselves, which is porous to some outside power, a person-like power. Now let's turn to the opposite pole. Evil spirits, those which tend to do us harm. Think of malefics. Here too there's a dimension we can make this, in which we can make this familiar, because there are beings who will us evil and can bring about conditions in which evil befalls. It sounds just like a human enemy, only this one has a repertory of evil tricks which go way beyond the human. They can, because it's a demon, it can work behind the scenes. It can make invisible things suddenly trip the person up, or and it also goes from outside to inside. So what he's described so far, this would be symmetrical, what the demon does, to the external protection that Aphrodite gives to the budding relationship. But once again, the evil spirit has more than just weird and impressive external powers. The malevolence is more invasive than this. It can sap our very will to survive. It can penetrate us as living, willing beings, affecting our purposes and intent. We can't restrict. This is, I don't have the rest of it here. I just copied this one page, but it can affect our intentions and our strength of will from within, because that's this power. Now, what the great, and this particularly was carried by inside later medieval Christianity, and then the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and then it was taken up with even more power by the early modern kind of Enlightenment mentality that Descartes and Locke and those represent. And in this case, see, what I'd like you to see is that the condition I just described is a condition in which the self is permeable and spirits, influences, bad and good, pervade the whole world, but they also pervade us from within, and we are vulnerable to them. And it creates the potential for a certain field of anxiety, and you then do things to overcome that anxiety, like you entreat the god or the goddess, you do special prayers, you do particular rituals, you avoid certain places that you know are haunted in a very problematic way, and you go to the places where special healing powers are and where you'll be. So you're living in a world in which invisible and magical realities are penetrating, and in some ways you're vulnerable at all times. This, you get the archaic version of this with the when astrology really comes in, and you've got the stars up here, and Venus is one of them. And then Venus raised down her influences on us, and as do the other planets. And there's hierarchies of astrologers and priests, and the king and pharaoh at the top, etc. But it is still very much a permeable psyche. But there is starting to become more differentiation of agency, of human agency. The pharaoh in particular is carrying a lot. But then, what really makes the breakthrough is the full axial, where God is experienced in the Judaic and Christian tradition in the West as outweighing in its power all the intracosmic spirits. At first, those intracosmic spirits and forces and relics and magical objects and magical actions, all those keep existing, but they are outweighed by the sheer power of God, who can, and the saints and the Virgin Mary, and they can come in and bring in grace, they can protect you, but they're superior ultimately. Like, belief in God provided an enormous centering and strengthening of a sense that you could be safe in this world of the multiple forces we were normally vulnerable to because they so easily penetrated into us. In a sense, we start identifying with that strength. My belief in God gives me a belief that I can encounter these forces with greater confidence because I've got God on my side. And eventually, and this starts happening in the course of the 16th century, and definitely by the 17th, the more shaded the enchantment starts to disappear. It gets neutralized. It's not, at first, it's very still there, like with the witchcraft horrors and that kind of social epidemic that happens. That's coming from a place where the early modern self has got it's just getting strength, but it's still very nascent. It's still or nascent. It's very young. It's vulnerable, and the magical powers that are still present, the anxieties of what's out there in the forest and in the magic potions and what's that witch thinking about me, etc., is still, in a way, witchcraft became way more of an obsession and a destructive, violent obsession in the 16th century and even into the 17th century, like in America, the Salem. Way more than it was in, say, Thomas Aquinas's period, who had a much more sort of modern, realistic assessment of that phenomenon. And Taylor makes, I think, the very good point that the reason for that is because this new autonomous agency was starting to emerge, and it felt much more vulnerable. And it wasn't, but then it became stronger and stronger until these powers out there ceased to be. First, they all got lumped in. They were all the devil. all the different malevolent and neutral forces that were more, spirits and luminously charged objects and places and times, they all got lumped into either they're good and they're on the side of the white magic of the church, of the Christian viewpoint, or they're the devil. There isn't all these other gods and goddesses and spirits, etc. And then eventually the world gets cleansed of it altogether, and you get the much kind of, the classic modern disenchantment. This is just matter and energy. We have nothing to be afraid of. But what gave them the confidence for that was this relationship to an all-powerful good deity who ultimately overcame those other forces. And then it's getting more and more rationally empowered. It gets more and more skeptical about the reality of these, and then you finally end up with the modern worldview, the modern self, and in a sense, this transcendent divine has done its job, and it kind of disappears. It gets interjected in here, and now we not only have taken in the whole anima mundi, but we've also taken in the sense of superior moral rational agency that comes from God and Plato's nous, the cosmic mind. We've interjected it. Modern science has shown that we're the most brilliant intelligence around, and also we're capable of moral self-rule in a way that wasn't a source of confidence in earlier eras. Okay, and so the crucial moment, Jung describes this as since the stars have fallen from heaven and our highest symbols have paled, a secret life holds sway in the unconscious. That is why we have a psychology today and why we speak of the unconscious. All this would be quite superfluous in an age or culture that possessed symbols. So what he's talking about there is that all the symbolic consciousness that pervaded the world and pervaded the heavens in earlier eras has now been totally interjected, but because of the nature of the modern rational ego, it has suppressed those into the unconscious. So it's all in the unconscious now. And he says the way we get reconnected to it is through the interior self-reflection and self-exploration of depth psychology, going depth psychology and reconnecting to those powers. But the only reason we have a psychology today is because we don't have an astrology today, is how we put it at another time, or a symbolically meaningful worldview that extends beyond just the human sphere. And then there's this one last step, which in many ways our course represents the fruit of. If we take here the postmodern, isolated speck of dust in the vast cosmic void, totally decentered, with a sense that every reality we think we have is being projected just by our own subjectivity, but then also starting to recognize that the way we engage the world is what our worldviews create worlds, that the realities start being constellated by our own approach to reality, that we're in a relationship that has consequences. And more than that, that this is an indeterminate reality. It's not just all so clear as the disenchanted modern one. In fact, there's, with synchronicities and multiple worldviews that are floating around, shamanic and so forth, esoteric, we can tap into, through our worldviews, enchanted perspectives that allow us a more complex sense of what's possible. And here, this is the great quote that you've heard me speak of before from Bruno Schulz, the early 20th century Polish writer. He's kind of like Kafka, fiction, very individualistically original Polish fiction writer. And he said, "So it comes to pass that when we pursue an inquiry beyond a certain depth," use that descent into the underworld, we step out of the field of psychological categories and enter the sphere of the ultimate mysteries of life, the floorboards of the soul to which we try to penetrate in our depths, fan open and reveal the starry firmament. I mean, that's the crucial, this basically, it fans open and it reveals the starry firmament and essentially the the ensouled cosmos. And so we're at this kind of, you are here, kind of, and this is our practice. What we're doing when we're doing transit analysis, natal analysis, is we are taking out of the enormous range of methodologies and epistemologies and worldviews that we could engage, explore, put our libido into, etc. In this course, we've adopted a particular one that allows us to enter into an ensouled cosmology, which in turn, recreates this self. This starts taking on new meaning. We start feeling, we start moving out of the encapsulated bubble of modern consciousness, but because we have been forged as a differentiated consciousness, we're not in the much more permeable state of vulnerability to the incursions of intracosmic forces or all-powerful astral deities, etc. It's much more of a relational and active, co-creative modus vivendi. Okay, so the main reason that I bring that up is to situate what we're doing in kind of the larger PCC context, that where we address the issue of disenchantment and enchantment and disenchantment. Those of you who've ever seen that conversation that Matt Siegel and I had at Esalen, it's a 20-minute conversation where we talked about disenchantment and re-enchantment, but also the idea of misenchantment that Matt brought in, particularly drawing on the work of, I'm blocking his name right now, sorry, it'll come to you, but that concern with really understanding what brought us to this point historically, all the religious factors, cosmological, scientific, psychological, social too. There's the moving from the tribe to the archaic civilizations to the axial forms of our civilization, then modern, etc. All of those are related to cosmologies. So I wanted to emphasize how much we kind of are entering into an engagement with powerful archetypal realities and forces, intracosmic, that the deep. Yvonne, my wife, said this to me the other day. It's just really interesting. It's like the more you know about it, as if you're a careful, psychologically reflective person. She's a Jungian therapist who just sees patients dozens each week and is constantly engaged with that, attuning to what's going on underneath the surface and in herself as well. And then also to have the astrological lens, it totally eliminates day after day that earlier sense that you might have of I'm thinking this. This is my conscious decision here, and I'm captain of my fate, etc. You have much more of a sense of oh wow, look at how my consciousness has been really swayed to see this particular situation or that person by the transits that were going on at that time, which were activating this particular, complex or this particular potential for bias or distortion, or opening me up in a very positive way that wouldn't have been otherwise available to me. It gives us much more of a sense of being a kind of delicate meeting ground or nexus of many different principles and forces that are at work in our lives and are working within us as well as externally. Those archetypes can shape how I feel about the day in a certain way. But by having this tremendous gift, the tool or instrument of archetypal astrology, we're able to, in some sense, like Copernicus, get off the planet, the Earth, and see, whoa, it's moving, and get a whole nother cosmology that opens up as a result of that transcendence. Remember the idea of transcendence. It's like very much part of our primate heritage. Transcending is related to ascending and descending, like up a tree. We grasp ideas and we climb, we ascend, we descend, we transcend, we grasp larger perspectives that give us a capacity to place our own subjectivity on the table and relate to it, rather than just being so swept up in it and dominated by it that there's no leverage for agency. There's we don't have a say in it, and this provides us with a capacity to see, like, I recognize that little thing that just is taking over my consciousness right now, and I better, I can do this or that to kind of lessen its potential negative consequences in the world, or in my own inner life, etc. Does that all that make sense? I'm kind of weaving together, depth psychology's whole motivation with the astrological, but also trying to embed it in a larger evolution of worldviews where we take seriously what other eras and cultures took seriously, including the transitional ones that moved out of, like, the medieval consciousness, which was still primal in lots of ways and still archaic. It was very astrological period, the medieval. It was very axial because it was, Catholic Church, the Pope, God, the King, but in this kind of so you had that archaic pyramid, but you had the transcendent God above all, but you also had a very primal sense of being in the tribal community and in a world of spirits and intracosmic powers, places. So if we take all that seriously, and we take seriously the moment that it was differentiating, that gave birth to the modern self, as having its own nobility, its own raison d'etre, serving the same role that our differentiation from our families, for example, can take place. The adolescence of where we totally just tell our parents to fuck off. You guys know nothing, and then that turns out to be not an inadequate recognition of who they are, what they've given to you, and in some sense, that may have been a rather unskillful way of relating to that moment, but it was serving a kind of healthy impulse towards differentiation of a new being and a new mode of life. Please.
Two questions. One was, you were talking about an author, Taylor.
Charles Taylor, yeah.
Charles Taylor.
What was the book?
That book that I was quoting from is a book called A Secular Age. It's about an 800-page book. it's big. And then he has two masterpieces, that one and one called, the other one is called Sources of the Self, the Making of the Modern Identity. That was about 600 pages. And Jake Sherman and I are going to teach a whole course using Charles Taylor on the forging of the modern self, the evolution of it, in the fall of 2019, like a year from this fall. We're going to teach a course on it. So all of you who are still in PCC then would be welcome to take it, or at CIIS. But if you're alums, I'll lean on Jake to have the same policy as me, to have people who are alums to be able to participate. It's the course that I've been waiting for 2 or 3 years to. It's the natural sequel to the Evolution of Religion course that we did, where we used Robert Bella's book, Religion and Human Evolution. And Bella and Taylor, they're very similar age. Bella's now deceased, but between the two of them, they covered from the Paleolithic to the postmodern. And while they don't know certain things that we in PCC know, what they know, we need to know. They have certain crucial insights that radically enhance our ability to do what our project is. And there's other people like that. I mean, everybody has blind spots and gifts, but these are particularly useful thinkers. So Charles Taylor, that's that, and it's A Secular Age is where that one was.